Thank you, Howard. I'm not touching that button. You scared me when you said it had a self-destruct feature, so can I make a deal with you? You'll change them? Excellent. Because frankly, a little over a decade ago, I was giving an address to the summer IPAA conference, and early on, I changed slides, and the projector turned off, the sound system turned off, the lights turned off. And there were 400 people in the room, and I'm like, what happened? And the audiovisual gentleman in the back shouted out at me, goes, "Did you touch the bottom button?" And I'm like, maybe. I normally can do these things just fine. It's because of COVID, given a lot fewer talks in the last couple of years, so I decided, I'm going to write down my thoughts. And I took into account the fact that this is a highly informed audience. You watch and listen to Bloomberg, to CNBC, Reuters, mainstream media, any number of professional journals. You know everything I'm going to tell you, but I want to try to put it into a pattern, into a fabric. But I also felt like tearing this up because in the last 10 days, virtually every single comment has been said on either Bloomberg, CNBC, or Reuters. And the final thing this morning is Kramer goes, and if you think that just high gasoline and diesel prices are just going to keep driving inflation higher and higher, you're just flat wrong. So I'm flat wrong. Because he started talking about the drop in used car prices and TVs are going to get cheaper and some other things. I got news for you. Nobody drove a TV here today. So I decided not to tear it up. I'm gonna hang on to it because it has a couple of thoughts that I want to get back to. So we've been teased to the point of just saturation with the war in Ukraine, with COVID. I could have put this title, that COVID exposes the weakness of the integration of global commodities, particularly energy commodities. Any suggestion of it, and one of my early phrases is we're in a super cycle of commodities. Well, we probably are, but now that's become like every day you hear that on CNBC, morning, noon, and evening. And so I would tell you though that traders can take some comfort. In the book of Ecclesiastes, it says, "What has been done will be done. What has been seen will be seen. There's nothing new under the sun." And so there's been war before, there's been inflation, there's been stagflation, there's been political unrest, all these things have happened. But the concern, which again I heard yesterday evening driving home on CNBC, this time is likely to be different. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, maybe we can rely on our experience. Now, I was particularly happy to hear Mr. Thrasher refer back to the high gas prices and inflation of 1974 timeframe. Now, for the record, I was old enough to drive, but not old enough to vote. I do remember not being able to put gasoline in my truck, though. Then, as a young engineer, I got relocated in 1981, and the company subsidized my mortgage rate 2 percentage points. But what I had to pay was 13 5/8. That was my mortgage. Okay? So, interesting times can be coming. Are we going to have a reversion to the mean? Yes, maybe. But as we fear this time might be different, we do have some really unsettling things. So in crude oil, let's go to the next slide, please. Russia's been a key energy exporter. They're the third largest crude producer, second largest natural gas producer. They export a lot of crude, they export a lot of natural gas, and they export it mainly to Europe. Now, here's a little thing that you don't hear on the news constantly. I'm under the impression, just listening to CNBC and Bloomberg, that the sanctions on Russia have already choked off their oil. That's not true. It's like 500,000 barrels a day, maybe 600,000 or 700,000 barrels a day may be offline and not happening. The sanctions really won't kick in under what the Europeans are now planning until the end of this year. So you think things are tight now, just under the thread of this, when you look at inventories and flows, you go, well, things are tight. What if you drop another 3 million barrels a day, 3% of the global demand? It's going to make a difference. And so when you start to think about how that ties back into crude oil prices and then everything down the value chain, that's when things get really, really interesting. Again, you heard Mr. Thrasher talk about their coal exports. Howard, I got to tell you, I kind of wish the panel was still sitting here, because these are some true experts that you heard from this morning in very specialized areas, and I have, I know, so I have questions that I may want to direct to them in this, but so as tidbits enter my brain, I just kind of file it away. So I believe India got down on some of their coal inventories to the point where they were doing rolling brownouts, rolling blackouts. So India doesn't have enough power right now. They're short coal. What happens if they don't get coal from Russia or the global doesn't rebalance? They're in a world of hurt. So the integrated nature of how energy feeds everything is something you need to keep in mind. Now, I'm going to put a plug in for a book. I just on last Friday, I went down to the Petroleum Club and listened to Alex Epstein. Some of you may know that name. He's a philosopher, probably like an English major, and he's written 2 books, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuel, and he's got a brand new one he's just now putting out called The Future of Fossil Fuels. It's worth a read. I'm halfway through it. He uses some words too much repetitively, but part of the point is everything that we touch in life there's an underlying fundamental of fossil fuels have created things. Everybody in this room, with maybe 1 or 2 possible exceptions, had to use transportation to get here today. Maybe somebody lives in a loft over here and they walked. But everybody else drove, flew, suffered through Houston traffic. I don't think anybody rode a bicycle. And I didn't hear a helicopter landing. So everybody had to use transportation to get here. Everything that you see around here at some point in time was either made from fossil fuels or transported to this location from fossil fuels. So it underlies and ties into everything. Now, I've spent a long time in trading and analytics, and there's a couple of things that I've really learned to be true. There is an Amazon river of data, facts and figures flowing at you constantly. It's enormous. So as a trader or an analyst or a business leader, how do you figure out what's the important data? What's really going to affect the price? How do I sort this out? Now the good news is, along with that Amazon river, technology's gotten better. You have data providers that are sponsoring this program. You have people with analytic systems that compile it, artificial intelligence, news flashes, all the things are there, the tools are there, but you still need people. You heard about shortage of people, that drives trucks. Well, there's a shortage of people that think about things. There's a shortage of people that, can sit next to the trader or on his Zoom call and tell him, hey, look, here's this news article that just came out about India, so maybe we want to do the following. So let me give you some facts and figures. These are some of the things that I haven't heard on Bloomberg. So in the mining business, what I have found is the studies indicate for primary energy use for production, around 40% is diesel. So diesel touches everything. You heard earlier it's the tightest market. $6 diesel, $7 diesel, $10 diesel. It's going to have lasting inflationary effects. In the U.S., that number is 34%, probably because we have a better overall integrated grid and they can get power and not have to run diesel generators at remote sites. So 34 to 40% of primary metal production and processing is being touched by diesel, which is up and going to continue up. And if the Russia stuff causes the price of crude oil, hold on. Here's where I need to give a disclaimer. If I tell you something and say, that'd be a good trade idea, I'm not giving trading advice. If I give you a price forecast, it's wrong. Okay, that's my disclaimers. But are those numbers roughly right as far as you know in terms of the production inputs of what diesel is? 30, 40%. So you double the price of diesel, you quadruple the price of diesel, it impacts all of that metal mining. Well, they actually use a lot of diesel in drilling for crude oil, so you're using your own product. So diesel is touching everything. Transportation, depending on how you look at it, diesel is the largest slice of the barrel, or the middle distillate, diesel, kero, jet. Somewhere around 37 to 40% of the barrel, and it's tight, and it's not going to get loose anytime soon. So we're going to talk a little bit about then how that ties in. We heard earlier about tying back into agriculture. So a little disclaimer here, we own a farm, my wife owns a farm, I say we do though, in Minnesota, and the farmers that lease the land know what I do for a living, and so I've actually had conversations with a number of farmers, and these are guys that are farming 3,000 to, one of them farms over 25,000 acres of farmland in southern Minnesota or Iowa. So this is corn country, soybean country. And so what they've told me anecdotally is, wow, luckily we purchased our ammonia, which primarily comes from natural gas, early before, it was being affected because what was happening in Europe, it was already really high, so we bought it early, and thank goodness we did because now it's doubled again. But we're going to use less of it because I didn't buy everything I needed. And as usual, I forward sold about 35% of my anticipated yield. Well, those hedges, you're going to have to deliver against them because they're not going to want to write those checks. And so farmers are really feeling the impact of higher energy prices because they didn't hedge diesel for their tractors for planting season, and they're not hedging it for harvest season. So all they've hedged is a little bit of their corn and soybean price, and they haven't figured out what to do. What they're really asking me is, hey, what is ammonia price going to be next year? So, well, the good news is Henry Hub is steeply backwardated, so next summer is half the price. By the way, we're almost at $10 right now. The storage number came out a little while ago, 90 BCF. I think natural gas was trading $9.63 when I walked up here. So, we're getting close to $10. And said, well, but that doesn't mean that the ammonia guys are going to lock that price in. So if you can lock in good ammonia prices for next year, at least lock in some of it. And plan on growing more soybeans because that uses a lot less fertilizer. So, we talked earlier about the natural gas price spike in Europe last fall. Did anybody in here catch the article in September, I think it was, where the UK government paid to restart a fertilizer plant? But guess what? They weren't restarting it for the fertilizer. They were restarting it because the byproduct is CO2, and they needed the CO2 for their meat processing in the UK. So I went long natural gas the next day. I should have looked at some other things. So anyway, that trade didn't work out. So anyway, but they restarted it because food was being impacted by high natural gas prices in the UK in a way that I had never heard of. They stun the cow with CO2 to humanely kill it. There's other ways. So anyway, I grew up on a farm. So anyway, we talked about the impact of the high energy, feeding through the metals business. It's feeding through everything we touch through transportation. I'm not going to call anybody out, but I've seen 2 people already on their food apps, one on HEB and one on Kroger since I've been here. And, we're fortunate. I still go into HEB, and for those that aren't from Houston, it's an amazing grocery store. Kroger's, Walmart, grocery side, there's plenty of food. It's going up in price, but there's plenty of food to eat. Nobody in this room is going to be at risk of starving, and probably no one in your immediate family is going to go hungry because we're fortunate. But that doesn't mean the rest of the world is. So, you're hearing every day the headline, because of the Russia controlling the Black Sea, that the Ukrainian wheat's not going to be exported. You heard about wheat hitting limits, 9 days in a row. I think that was what it was, 9 days in a row. And the Ukraine is not the world's largest wheat exporter. They're big, but they're not the largest. I think they're like 5th or 6th. And in terms of overall ag, they're like 8th or 9th exporters. Russia exports a lot, and in fact, I understand they're stealing wheat in eastern Ukraine, and they're going to export it as Russian wheat. Little political aside there. So you have this situation where you have all this inflation, you have all this energy concern, and what I am looking at most in terms of dislocations that could cause black swan, tail risk type events is significant social unrest in a number of places around the world due to food insecurity. So the world's largest wheat importer is Egypt. If they get hungry in Egypt, well, they had problems in the Arab Spring started in Tunisia for a lot of reasons, but one of them was high food prices. So the U.S. as a exporter of inflation by our Federal Reserve, we're contributing to high food prices and food insecurity around the world. Obviously, the invasion of Ukraine has contributed to high wheat, high corn. They're a big corn exporter. Here's another little aside for you. All that baby formula that we now have snatched out of Europe, because it's really good baby formula. It really is good baby formula. A key ingredient to that is sunflower oil. Primary source of that sunflower oil, the Ukraine. It's all integrated. So when you start tugging on a piece of it over here, I think that, yeah, we may see a decent CPI number, because remember, they always exclude energy and food when they're publicizing to the public to keep us from getting our pitchforks and blazing torches and go after them. But when you really start to include food and energy, which is what we have to touch every day, you do not have to buy a TV or a used car every week, but you do have to go to the grocery store fairly often. You fill up your car fairly often. It's really hitting our pocketbooks. So you begin to see the places where food is going to become politicized. Again, India. India has canceled all commercially based exports. If you want to buy wheat from India, you have to go to the government. So the government's going to be making a decision. Okay, Bangladesh, we've always supplied half your wheat. What do we get in return? So there's going to be political stress, geopolitical, social unrest. I mean, those are the things that I'm looking at. Those are the headlines that I have put on my pop-ups so that I can look and go, that should create another trade. We should probably go another slide, because I didn't touch on that. I put him to sleep. Can I see the next slide? Okay. We talked about Europe being vulnerable to Russia energy, and I did touch on the fact that the sanctions and the embargoes haven't kicked in yet, but you can see OECD Europe and how much of the natural gas goes there. And we've had one of the top generals in Russia saying, we'll see how eager the Europeans are to send weapons to Ukraine when they're cold this coming winter. So Europe natural gas inventories, they were very, very low. They are filling at a record pace, which is keeping pressure on U.S. natural gas prices. And they're anticipated to actually top off by mid-September. Top off. They haven't slowed the pace one bit, because they read what the general said. And so, the rest of the exports, they don't really matter, except we actually have been getting some into Boston, but that's beside the point. Can you roll to the next slide? But where it does matter, talking about high natural gas prices, European power prices, not just because of natural gas, are sky high. If you look at this, you'll see that natural gas has far overtaken everything else in terms of installed generation and actual running generation at this point in time. And this all comes out of one of the most recent EIA short-term energy outlooks. They'll have another one in 3 or 4 more days. So you can see that it matters what natural gas prices are, and now with coal doubling, quadrupling, go up 6 times. You know, those are the top 2. So you're going to see power bills for people this summer that are going to blow their minds. Or if they're on a levelized plan, like I am, they catch up to you. So next year, my levelized plan is going to be double what I'm paying right now. And my wife's going to be like, but the prices came back down. I'm like, yeah, we're paying for the sins of the past. Next slide, please. So this is what the EIA is saying, that the power prices are going to be in the U.S. Much higher everywhere in the West, pretty much. I'm sorry, higher everywhere except in the West this year. And they're flat wrong about the West. There's a drought going on out there. And you have all the policies. But because of the amount of renewable in California, and to a lesser extent Arizona and Nevada, that's one of the reasons they're saying the power prices are not going to be higher. I think they're wrong. But power prices feed, again, into everything. You know, crude oil and transportation fuels are ubiquitous. Well, power is even more ubiquitous. Again, I have no button to push to turn all this off. Thank you for taking it away, Howard. Actually, I guess he left it up here. But it's just pervasive. How am I doing on time? Because I didn't set a stopwatch. Am I good? Okay, good. Okay, so touched on all of those nifty sub-bullets that, so, all right. So, you know, in summary, when you really look at our thirst for oil, for fossil fuels, for oil, for natural gas is a bridge fuel. You know, I worked for American Electric Power, which at the time was the largest consumer of coal in the United States, and as a actual investor-owned utility, it was the largest coal consumer in the world. Other state-owned things consume more coal. They didn't burn any natural gas, so I got a job, natural gas manager. Think about that cush job. We didn't burn any natural gas. But the Clean Air Act amendments of the 90s, they were going to, so we introduced gas into 8 units at 3 plants, and then since then they've added a lot of natural gas generation. We built a trading organization. They were the #2 power trader, #3 gas trader. And so, you know, looking at this over the years, you just come to realize a couple things. So how do analysts actually put together a price forecast? You know, I'm saying the short-term energy outlook, the EIA is wrong. They got smart people working for them, great models. They get all this data, all this information. So here's how you really build a price forecast that you can hang your hat on and maybe even trade on, both short-term and long-term. So physical fundamentals, supply, demand, inventory, infrastructure, and the things that drive those. So what happens when we have a significant hurricane that disrupts Gulf Coast crude production for 5 days when we're at $140 a barrel instead of $120? Does it go to $160? Well, it's not going to go back to $120 unless you disrupt all the refineries. So you have all these factors that drive physical fundamentals. But then you have trading fundamentals. The shape of the curve, who's long, who's short. There was a question earlier about, you know, why aren't producers hedging more? The answer was great. It is largely driven by banks and producers' expectations, but having given hedging advice to smaller oil and gas CEOs and CFOs for 15 years, I can tell you it's a hard sell to go in there when you're at 120 prompt and 92, you know, a year out, and 85 a year and a half out, and say, yeah, you should lock that 85 in. That's a really hard sell. So we do a lot of costless collars. You do a lot of things to meet the bank covenants. So physical fundamentals, trading fundamentals, and then technicals. You know, you may believe technical analysis, looking at charts, is just a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is the phrase I've heard many, many times. That's a phrase I've used many, many times. But what it can do for you, and these, by the way, technicians are great at explaining, oh yeah, this is why that did that. And sometimes they're okay at getting you in or out of a trade. But what I would always use it for is a short-term milepost to say, okay, there's an entry point into crude oil when you see this inflection or this relationship. Because again, price volatility and everything is relational. That's where you look at where the market is not efficient. And I used to stop right there, you know. Physical fundamentals, trading fundamentals, technicals, there's your price forecast, hang your hat on it. Was in Midland giving a speech like this, and they had a happy hour at lunch. I'm sorry, I keep doing that. They had a happy hour at lunch. So a gentleman about that far out in the room stands up right as I'm getting ready to talk and says, Tudor Pickering was out here 2 weeks, a month or so ago, and they said the price of natural gas is going to be $6 in the winter, and I hear you're going to say it's $4. Tell me why you're right and they're wrong. Okay. It's like, wow, that's a good challenge. On the fly, I came up with my fourth leg to my four-legged stool, and it's price path. If you're going to forecast $200 oil for this winter, what gets you there? Well, 4 million barrels a day of Russia cutting off, that might be a path. But if I'm going to forecast $65 oil in 2024, what are the 3 or 4 intrinsic and extrinsic things that occur, exogenous events? Well, maybe it's a global recession. And it has to be a significant global recession to get you back sub 80. I'm not forecasting that per se, but that's what cures this. Because hyperbolic says, we need investment. Well, investment in oil and gas takes time. And notwithstanding what Mr. Fink said, there is not much being invested, really, compared to the need for capital investment. So with that, wrap that up in a bow and realize that higher prices are here to stay for a while. They're going to hurt. It's chaotic. I'm also a Debbie Downer like the professor. And you're going to hear windfall profits tax, regulators, because if you think a super cycle, a lot of volatility is good and fun for traders, it is, but not so much for voters and regulators and policymakers they need somebody to blame. And so they will come looking for everyone. So look over your shoulder when you're making money. That's it. I'll take questions.
I've got a different microphone this time, so yeah. Make sure it's on. Make sure it's on. 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 Well, I'm a loud guy.
Yes, you are.
So, you gave me a great idea while you're giving your presentation, which is lunchtime happy hours. I think that's something we should start. We used to run a bunker conference down in Miami Beach, and one of our sponsors would always at their booth open a mimosa bar at 9 in the morning, which made for interesting conversations by 11.
Yes.
So we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Rena's walking around with the mic. There's a question right over there.
So I have kind of a two-parter. So in the last 6 to 8 months, more and more respected publications and economists are saying that the high volatility in not just energy but metals and most every other commodity is the death of globalization. Do you think that's true, and do you think that there's a risk of quasi-nationalization of like the energy sector?
Let me answer the second one first. There's always a risk of nationalization. I mean, you've seen it in Venezuela. You've seen it across the board that when discoveries are made, production starts, money starts coming in, and then prices go up, you see nationalization. It's occurred so many times in 40-year career that I can't even name them all. But it's a little bit like the list of the failures of the LME. So clearly there's always a risk of that. Quite a bit of the stuff already is nationalized. I mean, the Saudis went the other way with Aramco and sold off some shares. In terms of the breakdown of the integration, you remember I started out by saying I could have just said that COVID exposed the problem of being so integrated. Between COVID and energy and medicines and everything else that the supply chains have been so disrupted, particularly if we stay in a worker shortage problem. I do think, well, you've already seen the trends, where they're opening new plants in Ohio and elsewhere, to make the chips, where manufacturing's coming home, so to speak. So I do think you'll see more expansion in the Western Hemisphere to serve the Western Hemisphere, as China does whatever it does in the Pacific. I do think the spheres of influence geopolitically will also fray those bonds of the globalization, because those supply chains are fragile, and China's done a lot of work recently to make it to where they're sanction proof. Their top leaders no longer can own stock or whatever, or own stuff that's in other countries they claim, so that if they make a move that the rest of the world wants to sanction, the leaders are immune and their super yacht won't be snatched away from them in Fiji. So yeah, it's beginning to happen. I don't know how fast it will happen, but nationalization's always a risk.
All right, and with that, we're going to have to wrap it up. We're running a little bit behind schedule, but let's give Keith a round of applause here. Thank you very much.